If you ever hear your own name whispered with a smile in the middle of winter, don't celebrate too soon. Sometimes that smile is deciding where you'll fall. Evelyn Carter had always believed the winter hunt marked the beginning of a new life. Every December, when fresh snow covered the northern forests in a blanket of silver and the frozen pines shimmered beneath the pale afternoon sun, every pack gathered to celebrate strength, loyalty, and the bonds that carried them through another brutal season. This year was supposed to be different. In less than a week, she would become Damon Blackwood's mate. The future Alpha had promised her a home, a family, and a place beside him when he inherited the Blackwood pack. She had spent months convincing herself that his growing distance was nothing more than pressure from leadership responsibilities. Love, she reminded herself, could look quiet during difficult seasons. That comforting illusion lasted exactly until she returned to the lodge for the wool gloves she had forgotten. The great hall should have been empty. Hunters were outside preparing sleds, checking rifles used only for ceremonial target contests, and decorating the entrance with evergreen branches. Instead, voices drifted through the half-open council room. Evelyn paused only because she recognized Damon's laugh. It sounded lighter than it had in weeks. "She still has no idea," Damon said. Another man answered with a chuckle. "You almost made me believe you loved her." Evelyn smiled without thinking. Maybe they were planning some surprise before the ceremony. She stepped closer, her boots barely making a sound on the polished wooden floor. Then Damon spoke again. "By tomorrow night, she'll never make it back from the winter hunt." The words stopped her heartbeat. Silence filled her ears before the rest reached her. "Everyone will believe she slipped crossing Frost Ridge," Damon continued calmly. "The snow covers everything. Accidents happen every year." Someone else asked, "And afterward?" Damon answered without hesitation. "Afterward, I'll announce the engagement ended in tragedy. The council will support me, and no one will question the succession." Evelyn's fingers slowly tightened around the forgotten gloves until the leather creaked. She wanted to believe she had misunderstood. She wanted another explanation, another meaning hidden beneath those sentences. Instead, she heard her own name again. "She's too trusting," Damon said. "She always follows when I ask." A few quiet laughs answered him. Something inside Evelyn cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of thin ice giving way beneath hidden weight. Every memory from the past year rearranged itself. Every canceled dinner, every distant smile, every promise postponed until after the winter hunt. None of it had been uncertainty. It had been preparation. She backed away one careful step at a time, afraid the pounding in her chest might somehow echo through the walls. A draft swept across the hallway as the front doors opened somewhere beyond the lodge, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine, snow, and approaching evening. The familiar home she had known since childhood suddenly felt unfamiliar, every hallway narrower, every shadow deeper. "Tomorrow," Damon repeated inside the room. No mistakes. Evelyn didn't wait to hear another word. She slipped through the service corridor, pulled her heavy coat over trembling shoulders, and disappeared into the growing snowfall before anyone noticed she had returned. The cold air struck her face like a warning rather than a comfort. Bells rang from the village square as families gathered to celebrate the opening of the festival. Children laughed while tossing handfuls of powder into the air. Lanterns glowed warmly against white rooftops. The entire pack celebrated tomorrow's hunt, completely unaware that someone among them had already chosen the prey. Evelyn kept walking, forcing herself not to run. Running invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention could get her killed. She crossed the last familiar street and glanced back only once. High above the rooftops, the council lodge stood against the gray winter sky, its windows glowing with golden light. Somewhere behind that warm glass, the man she had planned to marry was calmly discussing the end of her future. A memory surfaced from years earlier, something her grandmother had whispered while teaching her how to read fresh snowfall. "When the forest closes one path, child, it opens another for those willing to keep moving." Evelyn looked north, toward the distant mountain range where every map ended with the same warning. Beyond those peaks stretched the territory of the Warlord Alpha King, a ruler feared by nearly every pack in the region. Crossing that border was considered madness. Staying where she was suddenly seemed worse. Pulling her hood lower against the falling snow, Evelyn turned away from everything she had ever called home and took her first step toward the one place Damon would never expect her to run. Evelyn Carter did not stop walking until the cheerful music from the village disappeared behind the whispering wind. Snowflakes drifted steadily through the darkening sky, settling across her coat and hair until she blended into the white landscape itself. The narrow trail leading north had not been used in weeks, and that was exactly why she chose it. Every lesson her father had taught her before he passed away returned with startling clarity. Fresh snow remembered every careless traveler, but the forest rewarded those who respected its silence. She stepped carefully across frozen stones whenever she found them, brushed away obvious footprints with a pine branch, and avoided the open meadows where anyone carrying a lantern could easily spot movement. Her breathing remained controlled even as panic threatened to overwhelm her. Fear could keep a person alive, but only if it never became louder than reason. Behind her, the bells from the winter festival suddenly stopped. The silence felt unnatural. Moments later, a long wolf call echoed across the valley. Then another answered from farther east. Evelyn froze beside an old cedar tree. Those were not ceremonial signals. They were search calls. Damon had discovered she was gone much sooner than she expected. She closed her eyes for one brief second. He must have left the council room, looked for her before dinner, and realized she had vanished. If he guessed she had overheard the conversation, he would not waste a single minute. Every member of the search party would believe they were rescuing a frightened future Luna who had wandered into dangerous weather. None of them would know she was escaping from the very man leading the search. Another distant howl carried across the hills. Closer this time. Evelyn tightened the straps of her small pack and continued north. The cold bit through her gloves, but she welcomed it. Cold kept people alert. Warmth encouraged mistakes. The trail narrowed until thick pines surrounded her from every direction, their branches heavy with fresh snow. Twilight settled quickly beneath the trees, turning the world into soft shades of blue and silver. Somewhere ahead, a small creek continued flowing beneath a layer of ice. She remembered crossing it years ago during a training exercise. If she reached it before the trackers did, the moving water might confuse their sense of direction. The forest remained quiet except for the occasional snap of an icy branch. Then she heard voices. They were faint, carried by the wind, but unmistakable. Spread out. Check the western ridge. She cannot have gone far. Damon was among them. She recognized the calm confidence in his voice immediately. There was no panic, no concern, only careful calculation. Evelyn. He called into the forest with practiced warmth. If you can hear me, come back. We are worried about you. The words would have sounded comforting to anyone else. To Evelyn, they felt colder than the winter air itself. She ducked beneath low branches and moved deeper between towering pines, resisting every instinct to answer. The man calling her name no longer existed. Perhaps he never had. 20 minutes later, she reached the frozen creek. Thin ribbons of dark water still flowed beneath cracked sheets of ice, producing a quiet rushing sound that almost hid her footsteps. She carefully crossed several smooth rocks before continuing along the opposite bank. Halfway across, she glanced back. Snow had already begun covering most of her tracks. For the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself a tiny breath of hope. It lasted only seconds. A bright lantern appeared through the trees behind her. Then another. Their warm glow danced between the trunks like distant stars moving steadily closer. Damon had brought experienced trackers. She could not outrun them forever. Evelyn looked toward the northern horizon where steep mountains rose beneath gathering clouds. Somewhere beyond those snow-covered peaks lay Iron Hollow, the territory ruled by the Warlord Alpha King Rowan Ashcroft. Children throughout the northern packs grew up hearing stories about him. Some claimed he defeated rival alphas without raising his voice. Others insisted entire armies change direction rather than challenge his borders. No one agreed on which stories were true, but everyone agreed on one thing. His lands were never entered without permission. Evelyn had once laughed at those tales around a winter fire. Tonight they no longer sounded like legends. They sounded like her only chance. The snowfall grew heavier, reducing visibility until even the nearest trees became pale silhouettes. She wrapped her scarf across her face and pushed forward as the ground slowly climbed upward. The mountain path demanded careful footing, but every mile carried her farther from Blackwood territory. Hours passed before she noticed something unusual. The The search calls behind her had stopped completely. The forest had become unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed quieter. She frowned. Damon would not simply abandon the search, unless he believed she had gone somewhere no member of his pack dared follow. Evelyn stepped into a small clearing where an enormous weathered stone stood half buried beneath snow. Carved into its surface was the outline of a wolf wearing an ancient crown. She had seen that symbol only once before in an old history book. Her pulse quickened. Without realizing it, she had reached the northern boundary. She had crossed into the territory of Rowan Ashcroft, the Warlord Alpha King. As the realization settled over her, another sound emerged from somewhere beyond the swirling snow. It was not a howl. It was the steady rhythm of approaching horses, slow, deliberate, and impossibly calm, as though whoever rode through this storm had never feared anything in their life. The horses emerged one by one through the curtain of falling snow, their dark coats dusted with white until they looked like living shadows moving across the mountainside. None of the riders spoke. Heavy winter cloaks concealed their faces, but every movement carried calm discipline rather than hurried suspicion. Evelyn remained perfectly still beside the ancient boundary stone, her heart beating so loudly she wondered if they could hear it over the wind. The lead rider guided his horse forward with effortless control before stopping only a few feet away. A silver wolf crest gleamed faintly on the leather saddle beneath a layer of snow. The rider studied her without a word. Evelyn lowered her gaze, remembering every warning she had ever heard about crossing into another alpha's territory. She expected an order to leave. She expected to be escorted back across the border. Instead, another rider quietly dismounted and walked a slow circle around her, examining the snow behind her boots. His expression remained unreadable until he looked toward the southern forest. Fresh tracks disappeared into the storm, but an experienced tracker could still recognize the direction she had traveled. He returned to the lead rider and nodded once. "She crossed alone," he said. His voice was low and steady. "No weapons beyond a small hunting knife. No signs of pursuit have reached the border yet." The lead rider finally spoke. "Your name?" Evelyn swallowed before answering. "Evelyn Carter." "Your pack?" She hesitated only for a heartbeat. "Blackwood." A quiet silence settled over the group. Even Evelyn understood why. Few outsiders crossed into Iron Hollow willingly, and almost none came from Blackwood territory. "Why are you here?" the rider asked. Evelyn searched for an answer that would keep her alive. Every instinct warned her not to reveal too much before she understood who stood before her. "I needed somewhere they would not follow." The rider tilted his head slightly. "Who?" She looked toward the distant trees where the storm erased every familiar landmark. "My own people." The answer seemed to interest him more than she expected. He studied her face with patient attention, as though measuring not only her words but the silence surrounding them. Snow settled across his broad shoulders without drawing the slightest reaction. He looked completely at ease beneath the freezing sky, like a man who belonged to winter itself. Before either of them spoke again, another mounted scout galloped into the clearing from the western ridge. He stopped several yards away before bowing his head respectfully toward the lead rider. "Your Majesty," he said, "no movement has crossed the southern pass. However, Blackwood patrols remain outside our boundary markers. They are searching, but none have entered Iron Hollow." Evelyn's breath caught. "Your Majesty." The simple words struck harder than the cold wind. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the man seated before her. Stories had painted Rowan Ashcroft as an aging conqueror with a face carved by endless wars. Others claimed he never traveled without hundreds of guards. The man watching her looked nothing like those exaggerated legends. He appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and composed, with dark winter clothing trimmed in gray fur instead of royal ornaments. His dark hair carried a light dusting of snow, and his pale gray eyes remained remarkably calm. There was nothing theatrical about him. The quiet confidence surrounding him was far more unsettling than any rumor. King Rowan Ashcroft looked back at Evelyn for another long moment before turning toward his scout. "Maintain the border." "Yes, Your Majesty. No one crosses without my order." The scout bowed again before disappearing into the storm. Rowan returned his attention to Evelyn. "You entered my territory knowing whose land this is." "Yes." "Yet you crossed anyway." "Yes." "That tells me whatever waits behind you frightened you more than my reputation." Evelyn lowered her eyes again. Yes. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of someone carefully assembling pieces of a puzzle. Rowan slowly dismounted. Even standing on the snow beside her, he carried no trace of urgency. He removed one thick leather glove and knelt beside the ground where the wind had exposed a faint imprint of Evelyn's footprints. His fingertips brushed the packed snow before he stood again. "You have been walking for several hours," he observed. "You are exhausted." Evelyn tried to answer, but her legs suddenly weakened beneath her. She caught herself before falling completely, embarrassed by her own exhaustion. One of the guards instinctively stepped forward, but Rowan lifted a hand, stopping him immediately. "Enough," the king said quietly. "She has spent the entire night expecting someone to chase her. She will not be surrounded here." The guard immediately stepped back without question. Rowan removed the heavy fur cloak draped across his horse and held it toward Evelyn. She stared at it without moving. "Take it," he said. "This mountain does not care whether someone is innocent or guilty. It only cares whether they are prepared for winter." Evelyn accepted the cloak with trembling hands. Warmth spread across her shoulders almost instantly. She had not realized how deeply the cold had settled into her body until that moment. Rowan watched her carefully, then looked once more toward the invisible border hidden behind falling snow. "Whatever story brought you here," he said in the same calm voice, "it can wait until you are safe." He turned toward his horse before giving a final instruction to the riders around him. "We are returning to Iron Hollow." Then, without asking another question, the most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories quietly invited the frightened woman every other ruler would have turned away. The journey through Iron Hollow continued beneath a sky filled with slow, drifting snow. Yet for the first time since leaving Blackwood Territory, Evelyn no longer listened for voices calling her name. The riders surrounding King Rowan Ashcroft moved with remarkable discipline, speaking only when necessary and leaving the peaceful silence of the mountains undisturbed. No one questioned her. No one demanded explanations. It felt unfamiliar after spending so many years believing every mistake required a defense. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern horizon, towering stone walls emerged through the mist. Iron Hollow was nothing like the stories whispered around Blackwood fires. Evelyn had imagined a fortress built to intimidate its enemies, cold and lifeless beneath endless clouds. Instead, she found sturdy gray walls rising naturally from the mountainside, surrounded by snow-covered pines and streams that continued flowing despite the freezing weather. Warm lights glowed from windows carved into the stone, and thin trails of smoke drifted peacefully from dozens of chimneys. People moved through the streets with quiet purpose, carrying baskets, splitting firewood, and greeting the royal patrol with respectful nods instead of fearful silence. The gates opened long before Rowan reached them. No horns announced his return. No servants rushed forward in panic. The guards simply stepped aside with calm confidence, trusting that their king required no ceremony to prove who he was. Rowan dismounted first before turning toward Evelyn. "You will stay in the East residence," he said. "It is warm, quiet, and close to the infirmary if you require anything." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You are not placing me in a holding room." Rowan regarded her with mild curiosity. "Have you committed a crime inside my territory?" "No." "Then why would I treat you like a prisoner?" She could not answer because she had never considered another possibility. Rowan motioned toward an older woman waiting near the entrance. She wore a thick wool coat beneath a neatly tied apron, her silver hair braided carefully behind her shoulders. "Mrs. Harper," Rowan said, "our guest has traveled through the night. Please prepare a room and something warm to eat." The woman smiled kindly at Evelyn. "Of course, Your Majesty." Rowan gave a single nod before turning to leave. He stopped after only a few steps without looking back. "No one is to question Miss Carter today," he instructed the nearby attendants. "She rests first. Everything else comes afterward." Several voices answered together. "Yes, Your Majesty." Evelyn stood frozen as Rowan disappeared farther into the fortress, speaking quietly with one of his advisors, as though offering shelter to a complete stranger required no further discussion. Mrs. Harper gently touched Evelyn's sleeve. "Come inside before the cold decides to follow you indoors." The warmth that greeted her beyond the heavy wooden doors almost brought tears to her eyes. Large stone fireplaces filled the corridors with gentle heat, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from a nearby kitchen. Thick woven rugs softened every hallway, while tall windows overlooked the snow-covered valley stretching far below the mountain fortress. Nothing felt extravagant. Everything felt carefully built to endure long winters together. Mrs. Harper led Evelyn into a comfortable guest room with a wide bed, a crackling fireplace, and blankets thick enough to chase away every trace of mountain cold. A simple wooden table held a steaming kettle beside fresh tea leaves and honey. "There are clean clothes in the wardrobe," Mrs. Harper said. "If something does not fit, we will have it adjusted." Evelyn stared at the room in disbelief. "Why is everyone being so kind to me?" Mrs. Harper smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Because His Majesty told us that you are our guest. He does not even know who I am." "Perhaps not yet," the older woman replied softly. "But he knows who he is." After Mrs. Harper quietly closed the door behind her, Evelyn lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she had become. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup of tea that had been waiting for her, letting the heat chase away the lingering chill in her fingers. Outside the window, snow continued falling across the mountains in slow, peaceful silence. Hours passed before she finally slept. When she awoke later that afternoon, sunlight reflected brilliantly across the white valley below. Someone had placed fresh soup, warm bread, and fruit on the table without disturbing her rest. There was also a folded note written in careful handwriting. It contained only a single sentence: "Rest until you are ready to speak. No one will force your story from you here." Evelyn read the sentence again and again, unable to remember the last time anyone had offered patience instead of demands. Meanwhile, in another wing of the fortress, Rowan stood beside a large map of the Northern Territories while several advisors gathered around him. One commander pointed toward the southern border. "Blackwood patrols remain outside our markers," he reported. "They claim they are searching for a missing woman." Rowan studied the map without changing expression. "Have they requested permission to enter Iron Hollow?" "No, Your Majesty." "Then they already know where she is." Another advisor frowned thoughtfully. "Should we return her if they ask?" Rowan looked toward the snow-covered mountains beyond the window before answering. "A frightened woman crossed half the northern wilderness to reach my border. People do not make that journey without reason." He placed one hand upon the edge of the table. "Until I know the truth, no one escorts Miss Carter anywhere." The room fell completely silent. Every advisor recognized the meaning behind those words. Whatever danger had followed Evelyn Carter into Iron Hollow had just encountered a king who refused to surrender those under his protection before hearing their side of the story. The following morning arrived beneath a clear winter sky that painted every mountain peak in pale gold. Evelyn stood beside the tall window of her guest room, watching the first rays of sunlight spread across Iron Hollow. For the first time in 2 sleepless days, her heartbeat no longer echoed with constant fear. The fortress below had already awakened. Bakers carried warm loaves through the market square. Blacksmiths opened heavy workshop doors. Children bundled in thick winter coats hurried across the snow toward morning lessons, laughing as they raced one another. Life continued with a quiet confidence that felt almost impossible after everything she had left behind. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Harper entered carrying a neatly folded winter cloak trimmed with soft gray fur. "His Majesty requests your company for breakfast," she said warmly. Evelyn looked surprised. "The king wishes to speak with me already?" "Only if you are comfortable doing so," Mrs. Harper replied. Those were his exact instructions. Evelyn nodded slowly before following her through the stone corridors. Servants greeted her with polite smiles rather than suspicious glances. No whispered conversations stopped as she passed. No one stared. She had expected curiosity. Instead, she found respect. They eventually entered a bright dining room overlooking the eastern valley. Rowan Ashcroft stood near the windows studying the snow-covered mountains with both hands resting behind his back. He turned as Evelyn entered and offered a simple nod. "Good morning, Miss Carter." "Good morning, Your Majesty." "Please, sit." A modest breakfast had already been prepared. Warm oatmeal, fresh bread, berries preserved from autumn, eggs, and hot tea rested upon the table. Rowan waited until she began eating before speaking again. "Mrs. Harper tells me you finally slept." Evelyn managed a small smile. Better than I expected. That is good. Another quiet silence settled between them. It did not feel uncomfortable. Rowan seemed perfectly content allowing conversations to arrive naturally instead of forcing them forward. Finally, Evelyn placed her teacup down. You have shown me kindness that I did not earn. Rowan looked at her steadily. Safety does not have to be earned. His answer lingered in her thoughts. Back home, everything had required proving herself worthy. Here, compassion appeared to exist without conditions. Rowan folded his hands upon the table. I told you your story could wait. That remains true. However, there is one thing I need to ask. Evelyn nodded. Did you leave Blackwood because you chose to, or because you believed remaining there placed you in danger? She held his gaze for several long seconds before answering honestly. I believed I would not survive if I stayed. Rowan's expression did not change, but something thoughtful settled behind his pale gray eyes. He asked no dramatic questions. No accusations followed. He simply nodded once. Then leaving was the correct decision. Before Evelyn could respond, the dining room doors opened quietly. A senior messenger entered carrying a sealed parchment marked with the Blackwood crest. He bowed respectfully before Rowan. Your Majesty, this arrived at the southern gate less than an hour ago. Rowan accepted the letter and broke the royal wax seal. His eyes moved calmly across the page before he folded it again. Is something wrong? Evelyn asked carefully. Rowan handed her the letter without hesitation. You should read it yourself. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the parchment. Damon Blackwood's elegant handwriting covered the page. To His Majesty Rowan Ashcroft, Alpha King of Iron Hollow. A member of my pack, Evelyn Carter, disappeared during preparations for the winter hunt. She has recently experienced emotional distress connected to our postponed engagement. We believe confusion has influenced her judgment. If she has entered your territory by mistake, I respectfully request that she be returned to Blackwood immediately so she may receive the support of her family and future leadership. Respectfully, Damon Blackwood. Evelyn stared silently at the final signature. Not a single sentence mentioned the truth. There was no acknowledgement that she had fled, no mention of the conversation she had overheard. Reading the carefully crafted words almost made her doubt herself for a brief moment. Rowan quietly observed her expression. Is it accurate? Evelyn slowly lowered the letter. No. Then it remains only one version of events. Relief spread through her chest. He had not assumed the letter was true simply because it carried an official seal. Rowan placed the parchment beside his plate. Blackwood expects me to return you without asking questions. Will you? She whispered. Rowan looked toward the snowy valley outside before answering in his calm, measured voice. Iron Hollow has always followed one rule above politics. He turned back toward Evelyn. No guest leaves my protection unwillingly. Before she could speak, another messenger entered the room, breathing slightly faster than before. Your Majesty, he announced. Representatives from Blackwood have arrived at the southern border. Rowan remained seated. How many? A formal delegation led by Damon Blackwood himself. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened again. Damon had come personally. Rowan rose from his chair with quiet confidence, smoothing the sleeve of his dark winter coat. Have they requested an audience? Yes, Your Majesty. Rowan glanced toward Evelyn. Then they may have one. She felt the familiar fear returning as memories of Blackwood flooded back into her mind. Rowan seemed to notice immediately. You will remain here, he said gently. No one will bring you to that meeting unless you choose to attend. Evelyn looked into his steady eyes and realized something extraordinary. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, someone was asking what she wanted instead of deciding for her. Outside, beyond the towering walls of Iron Hollow, Damon Blackwood waited beneath the winter sky, believing he had come to reclaim a frightened woman. He had no idea that the frightened woman he once controlled had already found the one ruler in the north who refused to surrender another person's future simply because someone powerful demanded it. The southern audience hall overlooked the snow-covered border where Blackwood territory faded into the endless white mountains of Iron Hollow. Damon Blackwood stood with perfect posture beside two senior council members, his winter cloak immaculate despite the long journey. Anyone meeting him for the first time would have seen only a confident future alpha carrying himself with quiet dignity. Rowan Ashcroft entered the chamber without ceremony. The guards opened the great doors, announced only his title, and then stepped back into complete silence. Rowan crossed the polished stone floor with an unhurried pace before taking his place near the tall windows overlooking the valley. Neither man rushed to speak. The silence itself became the first test. Damon bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, thank you for granting this audience." Rowan acknowledged the greeting with a slight nod. "You requested the meeting." Damon allowed concern to soften his expression. "A young woman from my pack disappeared during a difficult emotional period. I fear she may have become confused after our engagement encountered unexpected strain." Rowan listened without interruption. "You believe she crossed my border unintentionally?" Damon smiled politely. "She has always been impulsive when frightened. I simply wish to bring her home before rumors create unnecessary complications between our packs." Rowan folded his hands behind his back. "Interesting." Damon waited. "You describe Miss Carter as frightened," Rowan continued. "Tell me what frightened her." Damon hesitated for only the smallest fraction of a second. "Wedding preparations can overwhelm anyone. She has carried tremendous pressure." Rowan's expression remained calm. Pressure does not usually convince someone to cross more than 30 miles through mountain snow during the middle of the night. Damon answered smoothly. "People do unexpected things when emotions cloud their judgment." Rowan walked toward the enormous map hanging upon the western wall. His eyes rested upon the winding mountain paths connecting Blackwood and Iron Hollow. "Did you love her?" The question caught Damon off guard. "Your Majesty? You intended to marry her. I asked whether you loved her." Damon straightened confidently. "Of course I did." Rowan turned slightly. "Then why does your letter never mention concern for her safety? It speaks only about returning her to your authority." Damon maintained his composure, but the silence before his answer lasted noticeably longer. "I assumed her safety was already guaranteed once she entered your lands." Rowan nodded once as though considering the explanation. "A reasonable answer." Damon relaxed slightly. Meanwhile, several floors above, Evelyn stood alone inside the fortress library where Mrs. Harper had suggested she spend the morning. Shelves filled with centuries of history surrounded her, yet she found herself unable to focus on a single page. Her thoughts remained fixed upon the meeting below. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. She wondered whether Rowan believed Damon's carefully practiced kindness. She wondered whether truth could survive against someone skilled at hiding it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. One of Rowan's senior advisors entered carrying a small wooden box. "Miss Carter," he said respectfully. "His Majesty asked me to deliver this to you." Evelyn accepted the box with curious hands. Inside rested several old documents wrapped in faded blue ribbon beside an elegant silver pendant shaped like a snowflake. Beneath them lay a folded note written in Rowan's unmistakably neat handwriting. "You said your life became dangerous after hearing something you were never meant to hear. Before asking you to relive those memories, I would like to understand who you were before fear entered your life. These items belong to your family. They were preserved in our northern archives many years ago. Perhaps they will help explain why someone might wish to silence you." Evelyn stared at the note before carefully unfolding the oldest document. Across the top appeared a name she had not seen since childhood. House Carter of Winter Hollow. Her breath caught. She had always believed her family had been ordinary members of Blackwood territory. Her parents had never spoken about another homeland. Another parchment described agreements signed decades earlier between several northern houses. The Carter name appeared repeatedly beside families long since disappeared from public memory. Finally, she picked up the silver pendant. The moment sunlight touched its polished surface, an intricate crest became visible beneath the snowflake design. It matched the ancient symbol carved into the boundary stone where Rowan had first found her. Before she could process the discovery, the library doors opened again. Rowan entered quietly after dismissing the attendants waiting outside. His expression remained composed, yet there was unmistakable purpose behind his pale gray eyes. "I believe," he said gently, "our conversation has become much larger than a broken engagement." Evelyn looked from the pendant to the king. "You knew about my family?" Rowan shook his head. "I suspected there was something missing. This morning confirmed it." He stepped closer to the table where the documents remained open. The Carter family once protected the northern winter passes long before Blackwood became a dominant pack. Their line disappeared from public records after a political alliance nearly 20 years ago. Evelyn searched the faded pages in disbelief. My parents never told me any of this. Rowan nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps they believed silence would keep you safe. Evelyn slowly looked up at him. Then Damon was never trying to stop a frightened woman from leaving. Rowan met her gaze steadily. No. His answer came with absolute certainty. He was trying to make sure you never discovered who you truly are. Outside the fortress windows, snow continued falling across the mountains while, far below, Damon Blackwood rode away from Iron Hollow believing he had successfully hidden his true intentions. He did not know that the forgotten history he had spent years trying to bury had just begun rising quietly back to the surface. Snow continued falling across Iron Hollow throughout the afternoon, but inside the Royal Archive, Evelyn felt as though the world around her had shifted far more dramatically than the weather outside. The faded documents remained spread across the long oak table, while Rowan Ashcroft quietly examined another collection of sealed records delivered by his chief historian. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence was filled only by the crackling fireplace and the gentle turning of ancient pages. Finally, the elderly historian adjusted his glasses and looked toward Rowan. "Your Majesty, the family seal is authentic. There is no doubt." Evelyn looked up immediately. "What does that mean?" The historian carefully pushed one parchment toward her. House Carter was never an ordinary family. They served as keepers of the winter passes long before the Northern Territories united under modern Alpha rule. Their responsibility was not military. They maintained the ancient treaties connecting every major pact during the harshest winters. Evelyn traced the faded crest with trembling fingertips. Then why did they disappear? The historian exchanged a quiet glance with Rowan before answering. Because someone benefited from people forgetting they ever existed. Rowan rested both hands against the edge of the table. When powerful families vanish from history, it rarely happens by accident. Evelyn slowly remembered fragments from childhood that had never seemed important before. Her father had refused to burn certain old journals even after moving to Blackwood. Her mother had insisted she memorize strange mountain paths that no ordinary family ever traveled. Every winter they had quietly visited an abandoned stone monument outside the village without explaining why. As a child, she had believed it was simply a family tradition. Now every memory carried a completely different meaning. Before she could ask another question, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. One of Rowan's border captains entered the archive and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, scouts have returned from Blackwood." Rowan nodded once. "Report." Preparations for the winter hunt continue exactly as scheduled. However, Damon Blackwood has changed the ceremony. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. Changed it how? The captain unfolded a small notebook. "The council has announced that during tomorrow's gathering, Damon will officially declare that Miss Carter abandoned her pack and surrendered her family honor by fleeing into foreign territory. Witnesses from neighboring packs have already been invited." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "He wants everyone to believe I ran because I was ashamed." Rowan remained perfectly calm. "No." The captain looked toward him. Rowan's voice stayed quiet. "He wants every neighboring Alpha to accept his version before she ever has the chance to speak." The room fell silent as everyone recognized the strategy. If enough influential leaders believed Damon's carefully crafted story, recovering Evelyn's reputation would become nearly impossible. Rowan looked toward the large map hanging beside the fireplace. "How many packs will attend?" "At least 12 confirmed delegations, Your Majesty." Rowan nodded thoughtfully. "Good." Evelyn blinked in confusion. "Good." Rowan turned toward her. "If the truth must be told, it is better to have every witness present." She searched his expression, trying to understand what he intended. "You are going there." It was not a question. Rowan answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Damon will never expect that." "Precisely." The historian slowly closed the ancient record books. "Your Majesty, if the forgotten Carter records become public, decades of political agreements may be questioned." Rowan looked calmly toward the elderly scholar. History should not remain buried simply because it inconveniences those who rewrote it. Evelyn watched him in quiet disbelief. Every decision he made seemed guided by the same principle. Truth first, reputation second. Power never came before fairness. Later that evening, Rowan invited Evelyn to walk along the eastern fortress wall overlooking the snow-covered valley. The sky had cleared completely, revealing thousands of brilliant stars above the mountains. Lanterns illuminated the stone walkway, while a cold breeze carried the scent of pine through the night air. They walked without speaking until Rowan finally stopped near the ancient watchtower. "You are afraid of tomorrow," he said gently. Evelyn gave a faint smile. "Is it that obvious?" Rowan looked across the distant horizon where the lights of neighboring territories flickered beneath the dark sky. "Fear is not weakness. Allowing fear to make your decisions is." She considered his words carefully. "I spent 2 years believing Damon would build a future beside me. Now I cannot even recognize the man I trusted." Rowan remained silent long enough for her to continue. "What if nobody believes me?" She whispered. "What if he convinces everyone that I imagined everything?" Rowan turned to face her completely. "Then they will have to explain why a woman willingly crossed 30 miles through a winter storm with nothing but a small pack rather than remain safely inside her own home." Evelyn looked at him without speaking. Rowan's steady voice never rose above the wind. "Truth has one advantage over deception. It does not require remembering which version was told yesterday." A faint smile appeared across Evelyn's face for the first time in days. Rowan noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed her the silver snowflake pendant. "Wear it tomorrow." She looked down at the familiar family crest. "Why?" Rowan answered with complete certainty. "Because no one should stand before the northern packs pretending to be someone they are not." Far below the fortress walls, stable hands quietly prepared fresh horses while trusted guards inspected winter supplies beneath the lantern light. No battle banners were raised. No speeches echoed through the courtyard. Rowan Ashcroft was not marching to conquer another territory. At sunrise, he intended to ride into the winter hunt carrying only the truth. And for the first time since overhearing the conversation that changed her life, Evelyn realized she would not have to face the entire northern world alone. The winter hunt opened beneath a brilliant morning sky as 12 northern packs gathered around the great ceremonial field outside Blackwood Lodge. Snow covered the surrounding hills like polished marble, while rows of evergreen banners swayed gently in the cold breeze. Elders, alphas, council members, and honored guests filled the wide stone amphitheater overlooking the frozen valley where generations of hunters had celebrated courage, unity, and tradition. Damon Blackwood stood confidently before the assembled crowd wearing the dark ceremonial cloak reserved for the future alpha of his pack. His calm expression revealed nothing of the uneasiness growing beneath it. Everything had unfolded exactly as he intended. Evelyn had disappeared. Rumors had already spread through neighboring territories. Soon he would address the gathering, present himself as the abandoned leader forced to carry on despite personal heartbreak, and no one would question another word. The master of ceremonies raised his voice across the valley. "Before this year's winter hunt begins, future Alpha Damon Blackwood has requested permission to address the Northern Council." Several elders nodded their approval. Damon stepped forward with measured confidence. "Honored leaders," he began, "our gathering celebrates loyalty above all else. Unfortunately, my own pack recently experienced a painful betrayal. A member of Blackwood abandoned her responsibilities and fled across our northern border without explanation. Although I pray for her safety, I also believe every pack deserves honesty regarding those entrusted with leadership." Quiet murmurs spread through the audience. Damon lowered his head with practiced humility. "Miss Evelyn Carter was once my intended mate. It brings me no joy to admit that fear clouded her judgment. I ask only that no false rumors divide the friendships our northern families have spent generations protecting." Several council members exchanged sympathetic glances, exactly as Damon expected. Then a distant horn echoed across the snowy valley. Every conversation stopped immediately. Heads turned toward the northern road climbing through the mountains. A line of riders emerged slowly from the falling snow, their gray cloaks moving gently in the winter wind. They did not hurry. They did not announce themselves with unnecessary ceremony. Their quiet confidence alone commanded attention. At the center rode Rowan Ashcroft. The moment the Alpha King entered the ceremonial grounds, every royal representative from neighboring packs instinctively straightened. Several elders rose to their feet in respectful greeting. Rowan dismounted calmly before walking toward the council platform. His expression remained unreadable, neither hostile nor welcoming. Behind him walked Evelyn Carter wearing a simple gray winter cloak fastened with the silver snowflake pendant resting clearly against her chest. A wave of astonishment swept across the gathering. Damon stared in complete silence. For the first time since anyone had known him, his carefully controlled expression faltered. Rowan acknowledged the assembled council with a respectful nod before speaking. "Forgive the interruption. I believe the Northern Council would prefer hearing every voice before reaching conclusions." The Master of Ceremonies immediately stepped aside. "Your Majesty, the Council welcomes your presence." Rowan looked toward Damon. "You stated Miss Carter abandoned her responsibilities without explanation." Damon quickly recovered his composure. "Your Majesty, she disappeared unexpectedly. We feared for her well-being." Rowan's pale gray eyes remained steady. "Did you?" The simple question settled heavily across the silent valley. Damon answered without hesitation. "Of course." Rowan turned toward the gathered elders. "Then perhaps someone can explain why a woman traveled more than 30 miles through a winter storm carrying only essential supplies instead of seeking help from her own future mate." No one answered. Rowan continued calmly. "When I found Miss Carter at my northern boundary, she displayed every sign of exhaustion, yet she refused to return despite knowing exactly whose territory she had entered." Evelyn stood quietly beside him, saying nothing. Rowan reached inside his coat and removed several carefully protected documents. "During her stay in Iron Hollow, we reviewed historical records preserved within our archives." He handed the oldest parchment to the senior elder. "These confirm that House Carter served the Northern Territories for generations before disappearing from official history." Murmurs spread rapidly through the audience as the elder examined the ancient seal. "This crest is authentic," he whispered. "I have only seen copies in historical collections." Rowan nodded once. "So have I." Damon spoke quickly. "Ancient records prove nothing about recent events." Rowan turned toward him without raising his voice. "Correct. Which is why I also asked Miss Carter a very simple question." He looked briefly toward Evelyn before facing the council again. "I asked whether she left because she wanted freedom or because she believed remaining inside Blackwood placed her life in danger." Every eye shifted toward Evelyn. She took one steady breath before speaking clearly enough for the entire gathering to hear. "I left because I overheard a private conversation discussing how my death could be made to appear like an accident during the winter hunt." The valley fell completely silent. Damon remained motionless. No one interrupted her. No one laughed. Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes toward the council. "I did not ask anyone to believe me immediately. I only ask that no judgment be made before every question has been answered honestly." Rowan folded his hands behind his back. "That request seems entirely reasonable." The senior elder looked toward Damon with a seriousness absent only moments earlier. "Future Alpha Blackwood," he said quietly, "before this ceremony continues, the Northern Council now requires a complete investigation. Until then, no public declaration regarding Miss Carter's character or conduct will be recognized." Around the great ceremonial field, conversations erupted as representatives from every pack began reconsidering everything they had heard that morning. Damon had arrived expecting unanimous sympathy. Instead, beneath the clear winter sky, the carefully constructed story he had prepared for weeks had begun unraveling one quiet truth at a time. The winter hunt did not begin with the sound of hunting horns that morning. Instead, the entire valley remained wrapped in thoughtful silence as the Northern Council gathered around the ancient stone platform reserved for matters that would shape the future of every pack. Snow drifted gently across the ceremonial grounds while the oldest elder stepped forward carrying the restored Carter records in both hands. One by one, the council examined the faded documents, comparing royal seals, signatures, and generations of forgotten agreements preserved within Iron Hollow. No one rushed the process. Truth deserved patience. Damon Blackwood remained standing where he had delivered his speech only minutes earlier. The confidence that had once surrounded him had quietly faded, replaced by the uncertainty of a man discovering that carefully arranged appearances could not survive endless questions. Across the gathering, neighboring alphas whispered among themselves, recalling old family stories about the keepers of the winter passes, stories dismissed for years as little more than fading legends. The senior elder finally raised his head. "The council recognizes the authenticity of these records." A murmur spread through the assembled crowd. House Carter was never erased by history, The elder continued. It was simply forgotten by those who no longer wished its responsibilities remembered. He carefully returned the documents to Rowan Ashcroft before turning toward Evelyn. Miss Carter, the Northern Council formally acknowledges your family heritage and recognizes that your testimony deserves complete investigation under the oldest laws governing every allied pack. Evelyn felt the weight she had carried for days begin to lift. No declaration of guilt remained hanging over her. No whispers of cowardice defined her future. She had not won because someone powerful spoke for her. She had been heard because someone powerful insisted that her voice mattered. Damon stepped forward at last. Honored elders, surely one accusation without proof cannot outweigh years of loyal service. Rowan answered before anyone else could respond. His voice remained calm, carrying effortlessly across the silent valley. No one declared you guilty today. Damon looked toward him. Rowan continued. The council merely refused to declare someone else guilty without listening first. The distinction settled heavily across the gathering. Several elders nodded in quiet agreement. The oldest among them rested both hands upon his carved walking staff. Justice is not deciding who speaks more confidently. Justice begins by allowing every person the same opportunity to speak. Damon slowly lowered his eyes, understanding that the carefully controlled narrative he had depended upon no longer belonged to him alone. The council announced that an independent inquiry would continue after the winter hunt concluded, with representatives from multiple territories reviewing testimony and historical records together. No immediate punishment followed. No dramatic sentences were pronounced. Instead, something far more lasting occurred. Every leader present witnessed that reputation alone could no longer silence inconvenient truth. As the formal proceedings ended, families gradually returned to the festival grounds. Children resumed laughing across the snow. Musicians lifted their instruments once again. The winter hunt would continue, but with a very different spirit than anyone had expected when the morning began. Evelyn remained standing quietly near the edge of the ceremonial field, watching sunlight shimmer across the untouched snow. Rowan approached without ceremony, stopping beside her while both looked toward the distant mountains. "How do you feel?" he asked. Evelyn smiled softly. "Lighter." Rowan nodded once. "Good." She looked toward him with genuine gratitude. "You never once asked me to become someone stronger than I already was." Rowan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Because surviving required strength long before we met." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment before fastening the silver snowflake pendant more securely around her neck. For the first time since childhood, wearing her family crest no longer felt like carrying an unanswered question. It felt like coming home to a story she had never been allowed to finish. The afternoon sun settled lower across the mountains as Rowan prepared to return to Iron Hollow with his delegation. Before mounting his horse, he paused beside Evelyn one final time. "Iron Hollow will always remain open to you," he said. "Whether you visit as a guest, as a friend, or simply as someone searching for quiet, you will always find welcome there." Evelyn looked toward the fortress hidden beyond the northern peaks, then back toward the valley where she had finally spoken without fear. "I think," she said with a gentle smile, "I have spent my whole life searching for a place where I did not have to earn kindness." Rowan returned the smallest of smiles. "Perhaps you have finally found one." As the riders disappeared into the snowy mountain pass, Evelyn watched until the last gray cloak faded into the winter light. The road ahead remained uncertain. The investigation would continue. Forgotten history would still need to be restored. Trust would take time to rebuild. Yet none of those challenges frightened her anymore. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was choosing to keep walking even after discovering the people behind you were never truly beside you at all. Above the quiet valley, fresh snow continued falling, covering old footprints while leaving the road ahead untouched. And somewhere beyond those white mountains, where a king had chosen compassion before judgment and truth before convenience, a new beginning waited patiently for the woman who finally understood that the strongest future is never built upon fear, but upon the quiet certainty that real strength protects, real honor listens, and real love never asks someone to disappear in order for another person to rise.